First, we have Dr. Sharon Truter, and we also have with us Ms. Tenielle Page. Okay, and let me get the slides up. Okay. This workshop will be on neuropsychology, where students will be afforded the opportunity to learn more about the field from professionals and to get advice on how to get into honors and anything they should know should they want to further their career in the field. First, the topics that we'd first be covering are the honors applications from the different universities, giving you basic information on neuropsychology, and then finally our guest speakers for the night, Dr. Sharon Truter and Ms. Tenielle Page, will be giving you a professional's perspective on the field and how they got to the point where they're at, and after that we'll be having a Q&A session. For honors application, please take note on the various opening and closing dates of the various universities and what their entry requirements are, as this is important if you guys want to continue studying psychology. Wits's applications only open on the 1st of June, so please also make sure to go to their website to check what they offer and what their requirements will be. UJ will only open on the 1st of July, so please make sure you also check what their requirements are and what modules they'll be offering in the year of 2023. The University of Cape Town is already open, so if you haven't already checked it out, please go and check what they have to offer you. And these are the different financing options for postgraduate studies. As we know, this can be very difficult for students, and stressing about finances is not nice. So guys, please take note of this, as it's very important if you want help paying for your postgrad studies. I'll leave this on for a few seconds so you can take a screenshot, a picture, just something. Okay, moving on. Neuropsychology. Neuropsychology is a branch of psychology. It is concerned with how a person's cognition and behavior are related to the brain and the rest of the nervous system. Professionals in this branch of psychology often focus on how injuries or illnesses of the brain affect cognitive and behavioral functions. A neuropsychologist is trained to assist and treat people who experience difficulties with memory, concentration, planning, language, reasoning, and other aspects of learning and understanding. And an estimate salary is about 1 million, which is almost 90,000 a month, but this varies on your experience, your qualification, and where you are employed. So don't expect that to earn that your first year working. And then working hours are like about 40 hours per week, but this can change again depending on where you work and what your qualifications are. And the different career paths include clinical neuropsychologist, clinical pediatric neuropsychologist, a neuropsychology researcher, a neuropsychology professor, a rehabilitation director, forensic neuropsychologist, or cognitive neuropsychologist. And then we'll be going into our first presentation tonight, which will be done by Dr. Sharon Truter.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about how I got into the field of neuropsychology and sort of some tips and recommendations on what it's like to work as a neuropsychologist. I apologize if my picture is so dark. I meant to actually do this presentation at my office where it's a lot lighter, but for various reasons I had no choice but to do it from here. So I qualified as a psychologist in about 26 years ago. And my registration category at the time was counseling psychology. And after doing counseling psychology for about 7 or 8 years, I slowly started switching over to neuropsychology. And at that time, there wasn't really any training programs in neuropsychology, any courses you could do. The universities didn't offer it. And so it was a matter of really trying to just study the subject by myself. What really helped a lot is there was and still is an organization called the South African Clinical Neuropsychological Association, and they have an exam that you can write. That is a very difficult exam, but if you pass the exam, then you know that your knowledge of neuropsychology is on the level of an expert, not only in our country, but internationally. So I studied towards that exam and then eventually passed that exam and continued on my way from there. The field to neuropsychology is very different at the moment. At the end of 2019, an opportunity arose for psychologists at the time who already had experience working in the field of neuropsychology. They could apply to the Health Professions Council to register as neuropsychologists, and there was a two-year period to do that. So it's in that time that I also got registered as a neuropsychologist. So at the moment I have the registration categories of counseling and neuro, although I don't do any counseling anymore. The route to neuropsychology now is that you have to do a master's degree in neuropsychology to register as a neuropsychologist. And at the moment, the only university that offers that is the University of Cape Town. And to apply for masters at the University of Cape Town, they expect that in your honors year, you would have done a module of neuropsychology in that honors program. So the module might be called something like brain and behavior, might be called neuropsychology, but they would want to see that in your honors year before you can apply for masters there. At the moment, they take about 6 students a year, and unfortunately that makes it very difficult to get into the field of neuropsychology. The master's degree is also a 3-year degree. You do 2 years of classwork. What I mean by that is attending lectures, doing assignments, doing a thesis, and then you need to do a year's internship, which is usually in 2 major hospitals in Cape Town, the Truter Hospital, which is for adults, and the Red Cross Hospital, which is for children. Unfortunately, it's an unpaid internship, which means that if you're going to apply for the master's degree at UCT, you need to make sure that you've got enough money to carry you for the 3 years. You're not going to earn, unless something changes, you're probably not going to be earning anything during your internship. Basi, do you want there to be a certain time for questions and answers, or can I pause every now and again to hear if there are questions?
There was a designated time at the end of the presentation, but if you feel comfortable asking in between, you're more than welcome to.
Okay. Can I just pause there for a moment and ask if anybody has questions about that, how to qualify as a neuropsychologist? Okay. So all is not doom and gloom, because if you register as a counseling psychologist, an educational psychologist, or a clinical psychologist, you're still allowed to do neuropsychological work. You're just not allowed to call yourself a neuropsychologist. And if you do decide to go that route and register as a counseling, educational, or clinical psychologist, but you really are interested in neuropsychology, what I recommend is you then also do the SACNA exam. But you take it a little bit further, and once you've passed the SACNA exam, there's an opportunity for you to submit reports to SACNA, and if they, or neuropsychological reports, and if they are happy with the quality of the reports, then they will accept you as a full SACNA member. And if you can do that, then that shows your colleagues that and the world that you have expertise in neuropsychology. And why that becomes important is that one of the main types of work we do in neuropsychology at the moment is medico-legal work. In other words, we try to determine how a brain injury or how brain illness or disease has affected the person cognitively, and for whether they can, for example, go back to work, whether they can manage their own finances, whether they can drive a car, whether they can manage a firearm. And sometimes we need to compare how they were functioning before with how they're functioning now, so that if something happened that is like a legal matter, then the judge knows what sort of compensation to award to that person for the losses that they've had as a result of the brain injury. So, for example, let's say somebody goes to a hospital for whatever operation, and in the process, something goes wrong and they sustain a brain injury. One of the reasons they might do that is, for example, if they don't get enough oxygen during surgery. The brain is very reliant on oxygen. So if there isn't enough oxygen for quite a short period of time, the brain can get damaged. And in cases like that, it's a civil case, and that patient can sue the hospital, but the hospital would want to know to what extent, and the attorneys would want to know to what extent has that brain injury actually affected them. Another sort of typical example, and this is a lot of the work that we do at the moment in neuropsychology in South Africa, is people who have been injured in a road accident. And if they sustained a brain injury, then the road accident fund needs to compensate them for their losses. So neuropsychologists are often called in to work out what their losses are compared to before they had the accident. And this requires that we go to court. And if you are called to court as a psychologist or a neuropsychologist, you have to demonstrate to the judge and to the court that you are an expert in the field. So if you want to go into medical legal work, you have to demonstrate you're an expert in the field. That means that you can't start doing this work straight after university, because you're not going to be able to convince a judge you're an expert in the field if you've just qualified in the field. However, if you become a full SACNA member, you can easily convince the judge that you are an expert in neuropsychology. So just, I get a lot of students who email me and ask me, what can they do to improve their chances of getting into the master's program at UCT? And the answer is not all that clear, but because obviously I'm not involved in which students get selected there or not. But from what I've heard and from what my understanding is, they look for some sort of experience in neuropsychology. So if you can gain some experience in the field, that would be really good. That's a little bit tricky because the field of neuropsychology is obviously, you work with patients and it's all confidential. So it's not easy to get an opportunity to sit in and watch an assessment or anything like that. And it's difficult to find a psychologist who's willing for you to job shadow them in neuropsychology. But occasionally you will get a psychologist who will welcome you to come and visit them and just explain what they do and give you more sort of just a better understanding of what they do. But then other ways to try and get experience in the field is to volunteer at organizations that help or take care of people with certain brain injuries or diseases. For example, if you had to volunteer at a school for children with autism, or you had to volunteer at a frail care center for elderly people with dementia, those would be examples of where you can gain some experience and improve your chances of getting into the master's degree in neuropsychology. Of course, your honors points also count. So you want to get high points, high marks in your honors year. And as I've mentioned before, to get into that program at UCT, you need to have some neuropsychology module during your honors year as well. One of the things I was asked to talk about is just what a typical day is like as a neuropsychologist, or a psychologist doing neuropsychology. So what makes what we do quite different to other types of psychology is that we spend a lot more time with a patient at a time, but we often only see them once. So if you do psychotherapy, like with clinical or counseling psychology, you tend to spend about an hour more or less once a week, possibly for quite a few weeks or even a few months. Whereas in neuropsychology, the patient comes in, you assess them, they leave, and you might see them again to give them feedback. But if you're doing medical legal work, you actually don't see them again. You submit your report and your work is done. In our field, in our country, we don't do a lot of rehabilitation in neuro work. However, I'm expecting and hoping that's going to change in the course of the next few years. The reason I say that is that at the moment, the way the medical aids are structured, they are used to paying for psychotherapy. So as I said, if you do psychotherapy, you normally see a patient for about an hour at a time, and let's say about once a week for a while. So the medical aids are set up in such a way that they pay you for an hour per day for a patient. You can see them for 2 hours, but then the medical aid rate is proportionately lower. And you can even see them for more than 2 hours, but then the rate proportionately is even lower. So the medical aid structures do not support long neuropsychological assessments at the moment. And this is something that SACNA is working on to see if we can change. If we can change it, and I think we've got a good chance that we will change it, then there will be much more scope for rehabilitation, because then neuropsychologists and other psychologists with special interest in neuropsychology can go into hospitals and assess patients there, and see more private patients in their private practice. One of the challenges of neuropsychology, and this is probably the part that I think people like the least about neuropsychology, is that you normally have to write reports based on your assessment. Sometimes if you're seeing a patient in a hospital setting, let's say it's a stroke patient who's in a step-down facility, or it's a psychiatric patient with something like schizophrenia or dementia, and you need to assess them, sometimes those reports can and should be very brief, very short, about 2 pages long. But if you do medical legal work, those reports can be anything from about 20 to 30 pages long, and it takes a long time to write them because it requires a very high level of thinking and reasoning, and you usually need to do quite a bit of research into what is happening with your patient, and usually you have a lot of hospital notes and medical reports that you need to read through before you see the patient, that you also need to summarize in your report and integrate into your findings. So the report writing is not that much fun, but one does get better and better and quicker at it. And certainly with supervision and so on, one can improve a lot. So my typical day, or until recently, my sort of typical day looked like I would come to the office, I have a secretary, I can highly recommend you have some sort of person taking care of your admin. Once you can afford to pay that extra salary. And I then get my tests together, and the patient arrives usually with somebody who has known that patient for a long time. I will then interview that extra person that would call them an informant. It's maybe the mother of a patient or the wife of the patient, to get collateral information and to find out how this person has changed, what difficulties they have that they have noticed, etc. And then I would normally call the patient in, and I would then do a whole series of tests with them. So the tests are a little bit like IQ tests, but much more interesting and much more advanced and detailed. And depending on what brain injury the person has sustained, if they sustained a brain injury, or what cognitive difficulties they're having, or what disease you suspect they're having that affects the brain, you would choose your tests to measure different parts of brain functioning. Those test scores are then compared to norm groups. So people who have done those tests who are normally functioning, and based on comparing them to the normally functioning people, you'd get a very good idea of how your patient is functioning in those different domains, the different areas of the brain. The testing is actually, as I said, quite fun, and most of the patients quite enjoy them. They don't mind doing them. Sometimes you take a break if you see your patient's getting tired, or if you're getting tired. Of course, the whole time that you're seeing a patient, the other person who came with them is probably waiting in the waiting room, and it's a long wait for them. Sometimes I suggest that they go out and go walk around in the shops a bit if they want to, but most of them choose to stay and wait in the waiting room. We tend to feed our patients. A lot of them, when they come to us, they haven't eaten in the morning, so we'll make them a sandwich and coffee and tea. The ones that I saw now this morning, they came from very far away, and they drove through the night by bus to get to me, which is not ideal at all. I always say, I always say to attorneys, they must stay over somewhere close to my office the night before so they can have a good night's sleep, because you don't want to test people if they're falling asleep. Anyway, these poor people, that wasn't the case with them. So while we were testing the child, the mother did fall asleep on the couch, and while we were talking to the mother, the child fell asleep. So I do keep a blanket in my office that I can just cover them and make them comfortable, because it is a long wait. In terms of working hours and how many patients we see, I run mostly a medico-legal practice. And of the medico-legal patients, we see about 2 a week. If I saw the patients by myself, I probably wouldn't cope with more than 1 a week, because it takes so long to write the reports and do everything else you need to do. I can possibly fit in 2 a week if I didn't have a whole host of other things that I do as well. But in my practice at the moment, I actually have a number of psychologists who see the patients for me, and they do so under my supervision. So we discuss the cases, we write the reports together, etc. In that way, we can see if some more patients than we normally can. But I think if you're starting out, you'll probably only cope with about 1 patient at a time. There are practices that see a lot more patients in a week, but they are sometimes criticized for not doing a very thorough assessment, and their reports are not all that well considered either. And that's always dangerous, because if you do get called to court, and you didn't do a good job with your report and assessment, then you're going to be criticized in court for not being an expert. And if the court decides you're not an expert, then they won't even consider your report. And that's embarrassing. That's embarrassing to you as a psychologist. So you want to try and avoid that if you can. So my patients, they normally arrive from about 8 o'clock in the morning. We start the testing and the interviews at about 9 o'clock. And at about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, we finished. And the rest of the day I normally spend doing administrative things and writing reports and so on from other patients and preparing for new patients. My practice is maybe a little bit different in that to most, because I also offer a lot of training and supervision and that kind of thing. So that also takes up my time. But something that I can really highly recommend, no matter what type of psychology you go into, is to vary what you do. Don't do only assessments or only psychotherapy. See if you can vary it. Maybe do assessments and psychotherapy. Sometimes you do this, sometimes you do that. Sometimes you see patients in hospitals, sometimes patients come to you. And also, as a psychologist, I can strongly recommend that you make sure you are seeing other psychologists on a regular basis, and that you're not working in isolation too much, because it can become quite lonely as a psychologist. So if you join things like journal clubs, supervision groups, go to workshops, definitely go to conferences. That's a lovely way to interact with colleagues. I find I always feel refreshed and inspired if I've been with colleagues. So you definitely want to do that. In terms of what neuropsychologists earn, Bassi gave some sort of indication. I must tell you that it takes a while before you reach that kind of level of an income. One normally starts off very slowly, earning very little, unfortunately, until you've built up your reputation, because people are not going to refer to you if they don't believe in your abilities. So it takes a while before people really start to recognize your abilities and start to refer to you. For this reason, I strongly recommend that once you're a qualified psychologist, whether a neuropsychologist or another type of psychologist, see if you can start working in another established practice. It's a very nice way to kind of learn the ropes of running a private practice, because there are all sorts of administrative and financial things that one needs to know about running a private practice that you're not normally taught at university. So it's a good way to get used to that. It's also a way to stay, so you don't get lonely, being isolated. But more than that, it's a way that you can work under supervision or with people who can guide you while you are building up your reputation as a competent psychologist in the field that you're in. So I can strongly recommend that. If you do decide to go into medico-legal work, remember you can't do medico-legal work straight out of university. You need at least 5 years of experience before you're considered an expert in a field. The tricky thing with medico-legal work is that you're often also not paid immediately. So those payments can take 2 to 5 years to come through. That means for 2 to 5 years, you're working without an income. And that is also why it's a good idea to combine medico-legal work with other work that you do, and also to slot yourself in with an established practice where the practice already has a good reputation and you can start getting regular work without having to wait so long to establish yourself in your own practice. So that is just something that I want to highly recommend. Okay, I think I've covered about all the things that Bassi wanted me to cover. Bassi, do you think now is a good time for questions?
We're just gonna have Tenielle speak first, and then we'll move on to questions.
Okay, of course. All right, good.
Thank you.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to try and share my screen quickly. I hope it's going to work, but if not, then I will just talk straight off the thing. Can everyone see? Oh, Bassi, if you can just let me know if you guys can see my screen.
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm basically going to cover a few of the points that Sharon has already mentioned, and then just particularly elaborating on the studying side of things. And Sharon's covered quite a lot about the professional side. So with regards to becoming a neuropsychologist, I thought I would sort of start off on my journey. And yeah, for me, it's quite a privilege to be able to speak to you guys, because I think last time I was at Tux, even though I'm only there virtually now, was when I was completing my undergrad there and looking ahead at this sort of daunting thing of, oh, is it even possible to become a neuropsychologist? So it's nice to sort of be back and to talk to you guys and let you know that it is, and to, yeah, there's a lot of naysayers out there, but just to sort of keep hope and belief in yourself. So I thought I'd share my journey and then go more into the specifics of it. So when obviously, you know, we're all in high school and we've got to kind of make our decisions, and I sort of oscillated between medicine, teaching, and psychology, and I couldn't quite decide. And so I chose quite a broad undergrad. So I did the BSc at Tux, which covered genetics, human physiology, and psychology. And what I really enjoyed about that was it gave me both sort of sides of the coin, the biology of the mind, but also more about the psyche. And when I got there, I finally had now heard about neuropsychology and was really excited to sort of pursue that career. So I then chose, as Sharon's mentioned, the only university that was offering the course was UCT. So I opted to do my honors at UCT because I really wanted to sort of be able to network a bit more there, be able to get a sense, is this really the course I want to do? And I think that's really important when you are in your honors year to already start networking, to start making those connections. So even if you aren't at UCT, to still just, you know, mail lecturers within the department, start asking questions already, so that they aren't only aware of you, but you also have the information that you need to make an informed decision. Then from there, I went into the master's in neuropsychology at UCT, and in the next slides, I'll go more into detail about what that course entailed. And then went on to do the internship that Sharon had mentioned at Truter and Red Cross Hospital. So the course itself was very assessment-based, and I realized that while I still do, I love assessment, I also did want to go more into the rehabilitation side of things, and I realized I needed a bit more, or needed to further my studies in therapy. And so I chose to do the clinical psychology course at Stellenbosch, and then went on to do internship at Tygerberg and Stickland Hospital here in Western Cape. And then last year was at Pollsmoor for my community service. And then currently working at Western Cape Rehabilitation Centre, which is a state facility it's a step-down facility that offers rehab to patients who've had brain injuries and spinal cord injuries. So that's been a big blessing, because I think going into a state position like that has provided me with more of a stable income, because as Sharon says, I think it's really tricky when you're starting off. You don't really have a referral network per se, and so going straight into private practice can be quite daunting. So I'm very grateful for that. And then on the side, doing some part-time work at a center called Enable, which also works predominantly with spinal cord and brain injury patients. So, okay, so honors in psychology, from what I understand, most of you guys are still in undergrad. For those of you in honors, sorry, this will be a bit redundant, but for the honors in psych, Sharon said they mainly look at your marks. I saw when she was putting those pictures up that some of the universities are taking more than 40 applicants, but at the time, when I did my honors, they only took 40. So it was very competitive. So you want to put as much energy and effort as you can into getting those marks quite high. but of course within reason. So trying to keep a balance as well. I know by the end of my 3rd year, I think I was quite a shell of myself, sort of burning the midnight oil on both ends. And yeah, I think if I could have given myself some advice back then, it would have been to just have a bit more balance, you know. It was okay to sometimes go to gym or sleep in late on the weekends. But yeah, energy does go into the marks. Then to try and already start building up your experience. One, it does make your application stand out a bit. But then it also starts helping you build up your CV for when it comes to masters. But don't stretch yourself too thin. Okay. Then once in honors, try to structure your electives. So obviously for neuropsychology masters, you have to have at least one of your subjects has to be neuropsych based. But if there is an opportunity to add more, then do so. So for example, like if there's a forensic psych elective, look into doing that because that'll stand you in good stead as well for your medical legal. So just try to structure your honors electives as well as you can for how you sort of see yourself specializing as well, giving yourself a little bit more exposure. And then starting to network already with students and with lecturers in the departments, you can already start getting ideas like what research projects are happening, where can you get involved? It's also nice to have a bit of an idea before the master's program, because then you can also have a good idea when you start submitting scholarship applications, etc., if you're already involved in certain research projects, rather than kind of starting and then a few months down the line, then getting into research and then only the scholarships. So those are just some pointers. It's obviously not something you need to necessarily worry about. It's just some ideas. Then the master's course in neuropsychology. So at the moment, it's only offered at Cape Town. And they do take a limited number of people. So it's usually 6 to 10 applicants. And that's predominantly because with clinical courses, so even with clinical psych, there is a lot of hands-on supervision with the lecturers. And so because there's so much time spent between lecturer and student, it needs to be a much smaller group. Back in the day, WITS did offer the course briefly, but then because there was difficulties around registering with HPCSA, they had to close the course down. So I'm not sure if they will reopen it, but as it stands, it's still only UCT. So the first year of the neuropsych course, we focus specifically on neuropsychological disorders and how one would then assess those disorders, or how you would assess to determine what disorders are going on. And we did that for both adults and children. Obviously, the two are quite different fields because children, you're assessing within the context of development as well. So yeah, so those were very much separate modules. We also did quite a lot of neuroanatomy and also imaging. So we would be taught how to be able to look at brain scans. So if your patient has had a stroke and you're able to access a scan, you can not only then understand what you're reading when you read the radiographer's report, but also go through it yourself and kind of see what structures are implicated. And that would then also help you inform what domains to test. So for example, if there's been a stroke in the left hemisphere, you would know to look out for things related to language, for example. So yeah, and then of course neuropathology as well, how different diseases affect the brain. Our second year was more practical based. So there we were doing assessments of adults at critical care in the neurology wards. And that was in quite an acute setting. So you were helping the doctors quite a bit when it came to their diagnosis and how they would go ahead with management. And they, like Sharon had said, the reports were quite short. It was about 1 to 2 pages. Then the second thing that we did was child neuropsychology at Red Cross, and then DCAP is the psychiatry division. And those reports were quite a lot more, specifically because they focused a lot in terms of questions around the child returning to school. And so your reports had to be a lot more extensive in that regard. It was not necessarily acute, but more from then a chronic perspective. We also looked at ethics to sort of help us to know, the HPCSA rules and the laws and regulations in terms of operating as a neuropsychologist. And then we touched briefly on neurorehabilitation. But yeah, as Sharon says, I think that's a part of the field that still really needs a lot more development, and something that I felt I wanted to study a bit further in. So that was why I'd gone and done some extra studies. Throughout that time, you're doing a research project, and it's called a minor dissertation, but it takes a lot of work. It's really full time, and there are very, very few students who will finish that dissertation in those 2 years. Most of us carried our research into our third year, into our internship, and some even needed to complete it after that third year. So when you are choosing your research project, choose as wisely as possible. Same goes for your honors. The courses are very clinical based, so that's where a lot of your time and energy is going to go into. And so you don't want to be spending a lot of time waiting for ethical clearance, having to run around finding participants. Don't choose rare disorders, or you're already going to have to go through ethics because you're working with quite a vulnerable population. So just think very carefully about your research project. Then the internship was offered through UCT, and that was because, as Sharon said, very recently has neuropsychology only been recognized by HPCSA as a category. And so there were no paid internships offered through state facilities. So the university arranged for an internship through Truter and Red Cross. However, that was in an unpaid internship. There were some colleagues that did arrange for their own paid internship, but I wouldn't recommend it. It's a very arduous process. You have to make sure that the internship covers all aspects of what HPCSA wants. And yeah, I found it daunting. If you take a look at that HPCSA booklet, there's just lines and lines and lines of things. And so I just thought it was much easier to sort of follow a set program already rather than make my own. And then as it stands, there's no community service requirement for neuropsychology at this point. So once you have completed that 1-year internship, then you write the board exam. And then, of course, Sharon's gone quite extensively into how the other routes of becoming a specialist in neuropsychology and then doing that SACNE exam. So how do I get experience? Like that was also something Sharon said, it's so difficult to job shadow psychologists because of all the confidentiality rules and things that we come across. So one thing that I found helpful for me, I managed to job shadow a neuropsychologist, but I specifically only sat in when they were doing the testing. And that was helpful because I think a lot of the history taking and the confidential information had already been spoken about. So I could just sort of sit in the corner quietly, watch the testing being done, and then was able to leave when things were discussed. You could also, of course, do job shadowings at hospitals or schools. But again, that can, particularly schools as well, it becomes quite tricky because then you also need police clearance if you're around children. So just trying to get creative, meeting up with psychologists in their own time, getting a sense of what their day looks like, I think is also helpful, even if you're not necessarily observing clients. Then volunteering, for me, I found it really helpful, and I think some of my other colleagues have too. So during my honors year, I was volunteering at a company called Brain Injury Trust that was offering bedside counseling to patients in the neurosurgery wards. And that was really nice because I got to see what it would be like working with brain injured patients. So it wasn't only just for bolstering my CV, but I think also for me to see, okay, is this something I like? Am I cut out for it? Yeah, what's it all about? In Joburg and Pretoria, there's organizations called Headway and Brain Life, and they offer quite a lot of outreach programs within the community as well. So that might be something to look into in terms of volunteer programs, but even job shadowing or meeting up with them. And then another one would be, like I said, the schools or old age homes, just helping a patient with dementia and working closely with them can already start giving you a sense of what it will be like to work with them on a more neuropsychological basis. And it also informs then the panel, okay, this person sort of has some exposure, has some experience. Even with kids, when it comes to their assessments or sort of shadowing an educational psychologist in that way. So yeah, really just branching out, and don't be too afraid to ask. I think the worst is they'll say no, but then at least you've given it a try. Yeah. Courses is also helpful. Again, don't stretch yourself too thin. Put it in when and where you can. So during my honors year, I was doing a course with Lifeline. So that was a nice counseling course. And then through that, I could then do telephone counseling. So then that also added to the experience. There's Future Learn, that's quite a nice online platform with courses. There's a nice course I did on there called What is the Mind? And that gave a really nice understanding of both the biology of the mind, but also the psyche too. And that's actually presented by Prof. Soms, who is one of the lecturers at UCT as well. So that could give you some nice exposure as to what to expect. And then there's a platform called Calabash, which also offers some great courses. Joining society is also great. So within your res, within the university itself, because I think it also communicates a level of responsibility, a level of diligence, sort of putting yourself out there, getting involved. So it doesn't necessarily have to be psych orientated, but just sort of gaining some more worldly experience. And then SACNA and SISA are societies that are really helpful to join. So they keep you abreast, obviously, of the current news in the field, but it's also nice because they offer a lot of support and guidance. You can contact people there when you're needing some help. Also offer a lot of conferences and talks. So again, helping you to network, helping you to keep abreast of the knowledge in the field. Can I work? It's always a big question. The course, it's full-time, really. You are very busy all the time, and it can be difficult to hold a part-time job even. The good news is I found that there were a lot more opportunities for scholarships in postgrad, particularly as well by the time I reached masters. There were just a lot more, and I think the more it also depends on sort of your research project that you take, and your supervisor will be quite helpful in terms of guiding you on different programs available. And then if possible, try and find work that's going to add to your experience portfolio. So for example, I was assisting one of the psychologists on psycholegal work, so helping with supervisions around custody cases, helping him with his admin. I was a research assistant at one point where we were doing some of the cognitive tests on kiddies, so that also helped give me some exposure as well. Tutoring. And then some of my colleagues, so they chose to take a gap year, or if they didn't get in, then they would use that year to sort of bolster the experience. So a lot of them had there were some opportunities at UNICEF as well, where they could do some internships there, which was quite nice. So my biggest advice is apply broadly. Okay, obviously for the master's program, it's a bit different. You can only apply to UCT at this point. But when it comes to honors, for example, apply as broadly as you can. I think there were some times where I thought, such a long shot, there's not even a point. But yeah, I think if you put it out there, the worst answer you're going to get is no. But if you don't put it out there, you're never going to know. And then within budget, particularly like if you're looking at things, for example, like clinical psych, you've got to fly in for panel interviews. Okay, neuropsych as well, you'll fly in for a panel interview if you're not in Cape Town. You've got to think about transport, your accommodation, all of that. So when applying, take that into consideration as well. Okay, and yeah, I think I'll end it there, just so that we have enough time for questions.
Thank you so much, Tenielle. That was like so informative. I actually learned a lot. Thank you. Guys, if you have any questions for either Tenielle or Dr. Sharon, please turn on your mics or ask one of you camera shy. Feel free to use the chat box to ask any questions you might have. I'll go first then. Dr. Sharon, wait, I wrote it down somewhere. Do you allow job shadowing at your practice?
I do, Bessie. I can't always let people sit in on assessments, but I do often invite them to actually come to the practice to see what we do and meet some of the people there. And I think if you just spend a few hours in the practice, it gives you a sense of kind of the atmosphere. I think anybody coming and watching what we do and so on, most of them end up saying that's what they want to do. So yes, I do allow that. And sometimes what I have started doing this year is I've taken in honors interns. And what I mean by that is students who've completed their honors degree and really want to get into the neuropsychology master's degree and just want to get some exposure to neuropsychology. I take them in for 6 months at a time. And in that time, they do everything from reading medical notes to help us prepare for reports. They get the test ready for us, but it's all under supervision. So nobody's left to kind of alone and unsupervised. And then I allow them to sit in on like neuro supervision meetings we have. Sometimes I allow them, they have to sign a confidentiality form so that, if the identity of patients are revealed, that they'll keep it confidential. So sometimes I'll let them sit in on discussions about patients, and occasionally, if there are not too many people in the room, I allow them to sit in on assessments. So that is something I've started doing. So yes, I think as far as I'm concerned, I wish we had more neuropsychologists out there and more people doing neuropsychology. So if there's anything I can do to make it a little bit easier to get there or just get them a little bit more experience or exposure, I'll do whatever I can.
And do you have any specific requirements for somebody wanting to approach you?
They just need to email me at first. Some people, it's too expensive to come to Cape Town. So sometimes we just have a Zoom meeting first to see if this is going to work. I can't pay much for the internship. I can offer 1,000 Rand a month, which is really just, it covers petrol money, but it doesn't cover accommodation or anything like that. So it's really more suitable to people who are already living in Cape Town.
Okay, and Shibu, you had your hand up. You may turn on your mic.
Hello, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good evening. I hope everyone's okay. I arrived kind of late, so this may have already been talked about. So my question is, what if one doesn't perform good enough to qualify for honors? Will they have to like repeat third year, or I don't know, what would have to happen?
Sharon, I don't know if you want to take this one, but I actually, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I know that there are some that have sort of done courses or done things to sort of improve their marks. I don't think that they would have necessarily redone the whole third year. I also don't know how that would work in terms of your degree, because once you've passed, you can't necessarily go back. But yeah, I've heard of people sort of doing courses to bolster the exposure and the experience that way. Sharon, I don't know if you've got. Any other?
Tenielle, I don't think I'd also can't really add anything. I agree with everything that you've said. I suppose if one doesn't make it into honours and you take a year and do additional courses and things, it might improve your chances of getting in next time. But I don't know if you'd be able to redo the year, or even if it would be worth your while to redo the year.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
And then a Miss Betso has a hand up.
Good evening, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Thank you so much for speaking on this topic. It's greatly appreciated when we've had our master's preparations session. So I'm in honors currently. Neuropsychology has been that hasn't been spoken about. So I'm really, really grateful about this opportunity. I actually have a question for you, Tenielle. I noticed that you said that you studied further in clinical psychology. Am I correct?
Yes.
Why did you do that? That's my first question. Firstly.
So I think it's twofold. So when I in undergrad, when I decided that I wanted to do neuropsychology, I was very aware that when I would register, I wouldn't be able to, when I qualified, I wouldn't be able to register. So that was why I'd started sort of looking at the clinical psychology course as well, because without being able to register with the HPCSA, you cannot get a practice number, which meant that I couldn't claim from medical aids, and there were a whole bunch of things with that. So it would have been quite difficult in terms of getting paid. So that's what sort of led me into looking into the clinical psych course. And when I finished my honors, I applied for both of them and fortunately got into neuropsych first and then after that into the clinical. But I think why I stuck with it is also because, like I said, when I did the neuropsych course, it's predominantly assessment based. And I wanted to be able to also offer patients therapy because it's a big gap in the field. There's not a lot of neurorehabilitation happening out there. And so that was why I decided, okay, let me go do the clinical course, get some therapy exposure, and then combine the two in practice.
Okay, I see. That makes a lot more sense. And weren't you exhausted after doing all of that?
Yes, funnily enough, I think if I look back, because it's taken 10 years, this is my first year that I'm actually finally practicing. I think my most exhausted year was my third year. That for me was the hardest, I think, because I was pushing so hard to get the marks for honors. But yes, it was exhausting. But I think as you're learning within the field of psychology, and I think the master's courses as well, they teach you a lot about self-care. There's a big emphasis on sort of understanding yourself, understanding your limits. And I think as the years went by, I also got better at learning to balance and learning to sort of know where my limits are and where to focus my time. So yeah, it's a slog, but it's definitely worth it.
I see. And just to give a little bit of, can you guys still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Just to give a little bit of hope to the undergrads that are on this chat. So the honors class currently at Tux is one of the biggest ones that we've had. So currently our class is sitting at, I think we're 68 currently, which is very big. And you guys gave great advice in terms of apply widely, because the chances of you getting accepted at multiple universities is quite great. In fact, there's a big chance. And look, me telling the undergrads this is not to toot my own horn, but I got accepted to 3 universities. So it's there. It is possible. Don't sell yourself short don't make yourself feel like it's impossible. It is possible. Don't feel like you have to burn yourself out to the point of, okay, well, geez, I should take my own advice right now in honors and make myself feel like this. But especially in undergrad, I wish that I had taken more balance. But one last question. Do you feel that you need to be a certain kind of person to be a neuropsychologist?
I think it's a trick question, because I think you have to be a certain kind of person to be a doctor, or you have to be a certain kind of person to be a teacher. And I think it's more about you and where your passion lies, and sort of what you want to do. Within psychology, we always talk about this imposter syndrome. There's this idea that, oh my gosh, you know, how can I help other people with their problems when I've got my own problems, and I'm not good enough for this, etc., etc. And I think that follows most of us throughout our studies, and I imagine as well careers too. But if it is something that you're passionate about, and I think that's also why gaining experience and exposure is important, because then you start to learn about what actually is the job of neuropsychology. It's one thing reading it on a piece of paper, but to actually be there and see it, I think you then get a better idea, is this suited to me or isn't it?
So I want to just elaborate. I agree with everything that Tenielle said, and but I want to elaborate and say that when one does neuropsychology, you have to have the mind of an investigator, because you've got to think about what's happening in the brain, what do the tests say, what am I noticing about the person, what are they complaining about, what does everybody else say about the person. And it's an intellectually challenging field, which is wonderful. So you've got to put all these pieces together and try and figure it out, and put across a convincing opinion of why this is the case, and you've got to be willing to defend yourself in court, because even though you might not intend to go to court, you could go to court at any time. So it's an intellectually challenging field. What I must also say, I think what Tenielle's not saying, is that studying the neuroanatomy and neuropathology is actually quite difficult. It's a lot of people struggle to get their heads around it. As psychologists, we are not trained to understand the medical terms, and yet when you're thrown into studying neuropsychology, you've got to know all these medical terms and become familiar with them. And if you're working in a hospital setting, you work under a lot of pressure. The neurologists or whatever want to have answers almost immediately. And in the field of neuropsychology, you don't have answers immediately. You got to first figure it out and do assessments and check that, it's quite a process. So it can be quite a pressurized field. It certainly is an intellectually challenging field. I find, having done counseling psychology for a while and then neuropsychology is much more interesting. And stimulating. So yeah, you've got to be somebody who's willing to work hard, study constantly, because no matter how much you've learned about neuropsychology, you never know everything. And neuroscience is constantly coming out with new things. So yeah, you've got to be prepared to study throughout your whole life and always feel like you don't quite know it all. So you've still got to pursue that knowledge and education.
We have another question. Oh, his hand is raised, Mr. Odendahl. Not sure if I'm saying that right.
Good evening. Thank you for coming to speak with us. I guess this is a question that I would like to ask all psychologists, but since this is a meeting specifically directed towards neuropsychology, I guess I'll ask more specifically. And to each of you, one of my greatest fears, Tenielle spoke about imposter syndrome and not being sure if you're good enough for the field, etc., etc. And the fact that psychology, while I'm sure all of us, we don't question the validity of the field. There is still, especially in, I'm sure there are countries that are worse, but in South Africa, for example, my own grandparents, my parents don't believe in psychologists. So what is it like being in a field where you constantly, at what point do you start realizing that your field is valid, that it is that, and that you are valid, and that your work is worthwhile? I guess that's a very vague question, but it's one that I'm struggling with going forward. That I've been struggling with for quite a while. In the sense that I have this massive respect for psychology, and I have had even before I started studying it at university, and yet everywhere I go, I still hear people telling me that it's not worth going into. Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that.
Can I maybe answer that first, Tenielle, because you'll maybe have extra to say because you've also got the clinical psychology side. So I'm married to one of those people who don't believe in psychology. And yes, you're right. You know, the public often have this opinion that it's wishy-washy, like hocus pocus, airy fairy. And that's probably the main, one of the reasons I have enjoyed neuropsychology so much, because you can put data to it, you can put statistics to it, you can put test scores to it. There was I was teaching some students the other day on a verbal fluency test, and I got them just to do it on themselves. And the one girl in the class scored quite a lot lower than her classmates. She was a bit distressed about this, and she said, like, what is wrong with me? Am I stupid? You know, why am I doing so much worse? And I asked her, how many languages do you speak? And she said 4. I said, well, that's it. How many languages do the rest of you speak? And it ranged between 1 and mostly like sort of 1 and 2. There were 1 or 2 people who spoke 3, but she was the only one who spoke 4. So, and we know now from neuroscience that there's an explanation for why, if you have more than 1 language, you take longer on verbal fluency tasks. So what I love about neuropsychology is you can say to a person, sleep before you write an exam. Don't study in the morning, because when you sleep, that's when the information consolidates. So rather study late at night and then sleep and then write your exam, than go to sleep early, write and get up early and study and write your exam. So everything we do is kind of research based. And I find when you explain it to people in that way, because you've got that knowledge of how the brain actually works, it's like the lights go on. They're like, oh, right, I didn't know that. And oh, that makes sense now. And so for me, neuropsychology has made psychology concrete. When I was doing counseling psychology, I found it vague and difficult. And quite honestly, I never felt like I knew what I was doing or what is really wrong with this person, and if what I've done in this session is actually really going to help them. But that's, yeah. So that's my comment. Tenielle, over to you.
Yeah, I think I like what you say there in terms of the neuropsych. It's stimulating, it's fascinating, and when you see you how you sort of approach it, you have this hypothesis of what you think's happening, and when you see it happen on the test, and you're like, oh my word, like it's a very cool feeling. And to be able to sit and give that feedback to families and to see how it helps them understand the patient more, and just having that understanding how it improves the quality of life, I think is fantastic. When it comes to clinical psych, you have to hold the tension a lot more. You obviously get a lot of training in terms of how to formulate your client, how to understand them. And I think for somebody, particularly myself, I'm very analytic in thinking, and I like things, I like numbers, I like to have a black and white. And when it comes to the clinical psych, there's a lot of also feeling involved. It's not just about thinking. There's feeling in the room, and you've got to trust that instinct of what's going on. And I think learning to trust yourself, trust your ability, and obviously you have a lot of supervision in that process, something phenomenal can happen in that process. And when you start seeing those shifts in a patient, even though it's not quantifiable in that moment, it's sort of building, and you start to see those life changes. It's quite spectacular. So yeah, I always say to people that are sort of non-believers, you have this brain, but the brain doesn't just think, it also feels. So if you're only focusing on the one aspect of it, you're missing out on a whole nother. And every single one of us knows we have emotions. So there has to be psychology. There can't not be.
Thank you very much. Just to, because on the one hand, Dr. Truter said that the field, the branch neuropsychology actually does add some a sense of concreteness to psychology as a whole, and on the other hand, I as I'm more how shall I say, headed in the direction of clinical psychology. I am more of a feeling person. I'm not a fan of numbers. I like to work with abstract ideas. So how would you recommend, let's say I do open my own practice one day, do you think there is a way for clinical psychologists and neuropsychologists to work together to how shall I to add more validity to both, to make both, for example, is there any way for clinical psychologists to have evidence for their work bolstered through neuropsychology and vice versa?
I mean, like if you think of clinical psychology as well, and maybe I should have mentioned that a bit too, there is a lot of therapies out there that have been tested. I mean, it's not that what we're doing out there there hasn't been research on it, and you haven't seen the results on it qualitatively and quantitatively. But I think definitely in terms of combining the two, I mean, geez, yeah, that's what I'm doing, combining the two of them. And I think it helps if you've got, if you've done the assessment and you understand, like if there's a patient who's got frontal lobe deficits and they're struggling to self-regulate, for example, to be able to explain that and work with a clinical psychologist, they will then better understand when they're doing their treatment plan, okay, we need to spend a lot more time on emotional regulation here because this patient's really struggling.
Thank you very much for your insightful answers and your time. My apologies if I do tend to stutter when I feel I'm a bit insecure when it comes to asking questions. So thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you for asking.
We had a question in the chat box that kind of went past so many times. Ms. Byatt asked, to diversify yourself, do you recommend one to specialize in fields of clinical or educational psychology and then branch into neuropsychology, or to simultaneously work at the multiple fields?
I'm not quite sure what she means, because you would need to, when you qualify, you would need to choose whether you want to do educational psychology or neuropsychology. What I can say is there's a huge overlap between the two, because the educational or scholastic assessments are, at the end of the day, also assessments of brain functioning. I don't know if that answers the question, though.
I don't know. I think they'll respond if they feel satisfied or not. And then another question was, can one register in neuropsychology with the HPCSA at this current moment?
So yes, but only if you do the UCT master's course in neuropsychology.
Okay, and then I think someone had their hand up. I think it was a Miss Zamela. I'm not sure if they still want to ask a question.
Yes, I do. Thank you. This is for Dr. Sharon. I just wanted to ask about your method in terms of the hunch, is what I like to call it. When you first see a patient's data or information, there's a hunch that you have about what might be happening with the patient. Would you say that that wastes your time, or it, I don't know how to put this. Would you say going with the hunch helps to get to the problem or the root of the problem quicker, or it takes you away? And would you say that this hunch has always been there for you? Did it sort of affirm you in the fact that you should be doing this?
So I think one is very much hunch driven when you're doing neuropsychological assessments. You know, you right from the start, from the first referral note, from the first medical note you read about the person, from the first MRI report you read, knowing which areas of the brain have been affected, you have like a hypothesis. Like, this is what I think is happening, and this is what I'm expecting it's going to get better or worse. And so when you do your testing, you follow that quite a lot. So you test all the areas of the brain, but if you think there's sort of a certain area of the brain that is more dysfunctional than other areas, and you add additional tests for that to check get a sort of more fine-grained sense of what's going on there. And in that way, neuropsychology is also very satisfying, because often your hunches are correct, but sometimes your hunches are incorrect. And then neuropsychology is also satisfying, because you go on this long investigative thing that, you know, you've got to solve the problem, you've got to solve the puzzle, and that's very intellectually stimulating. I don't know if that answers your questions, Amela.
Yes, it does, Doctor. Thank you.
We had another question. I think this one's more directed at Tenielle. What is a good average to maintain to get into honors and masters?
Yeah, I think it depends on how competitive the year is that's applying and how many people they're taking. So for example, with my year, they only took 40, and at the time you had to clear an average of 75%. So it was quite a competitive year to apply. I think now that they are taking more students, it's probably going to be a bit better and a bit easier. I think the average that you have to have is 70%. So long as you're working toward that, yeah, you should be in the clear. And I was thinking a bit more about Sibu's question right in the beginning. If you don't get into the honors program or even the master's program, I found that the universities are quite open to answering questions or giving guidance. So it's also a nice idea to message them, say, look, I'm still very keen. What can I do to improve my application for next year? So yeah, don't be afraid to reach out.
And then Sarah, your hand is up.
Good evening. Thank you for the very helpful session. I just had one question in terms of studying overseas, or the possibility of that, and coming back to South Africa to register and practice as a neuropsychologist here. What is the process? Is it possible to study overseas and practice in South Africa, or how does that work?
Tenielle, I don't know if you want to give that one a go.
Okay, yes, so you can study overseas and work there, or study here and work overseas, vice versa. It is a little bit, it depends on the country, it depends on the program, in terms of what you would then have to do in order to register. But usually, from my understanding, let's say you've studied overseas, you would still have to come back if the course requirements are all met. If HPCSA is happy with the course that you've done overseas, you would still have to do your internship here and your ComServe here in order to then be able to register with HPCSA. And then same, going overseas, they might want you to do an additional course or additional years of experience. So I think it depends on where you are and what course is offered.
Is there any questions? Okay, so I think that is all. We don't have any more questions for tonight. I just want to say thank you so much to Neil and Dr. Sharon. Like, we really appreciate all the information you provided us. It's really helpful and it helps guide us and like give us insight into where we actually want to be. And I'm so grateful that you guys actually agreed to do this, because it's been hard finding psychologists who'd want to speak to us. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And guys, thank you for all joining, and thank you for asking questions and being involved. Grateful that you guys all showed up. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.